Hi everybody, here's Marcus Reed speaking, and this is part two of a consciousness-based universe. In part one, I suggested to make two parts out of this consciousness-based universe series. However, I realized that is a bit too short. I will make three parts out of it. That means in part one, I covered number one, water and quantum criticality. Now in part two, I will cover the point three, microtubules, and in part three, I will cover point four, quantum fluctuations, and give possible definitions for what consciousness is and so on. Okay, so let's get started. I just want to elaborate on some aspects that I mentioned in part one and in my other presentations because they build upon each other. Here we have the temperature line on the left hand side, the 0 Kelvin, and as we know, at very cold temperatures, reality behaves different, and it behaves differently because quantum fluctuations are running the show. They are determining how mass behaves. For example, a Bose-Einstein condensate can develop, which means that the wave function of the particles moves together, and the phenomena of superconductivity and superfluidity and action at a distance. These phenomena are possible, and the warmer you get, the more classical, meaning the more mechanical reality will behave. And there is an overlap where a material is classical or influenced by classical fluctuations and by quantum fluctuations at the same time. And for example, superconductors that are superconducting at non-zero temperatures, especially the high temperature superconductors, they are driven by a large part by these classical fluctuations. However, the presence of quantum fluctuations, they can determine the phase oscillation because these superconductors are usually in a quantum critical state. Now, let me get to the next one. This is my way of laying it out. So this here is the same as this picture. So what I've done is I'm starting here. This is would be our universe, this cone that is facing upwards. We're starting at 0 Kelvin, and then as the temperature gets higher and higher, the less coherent mass can show the phenomenon of self-organization. For example, life forms have a limit at about 80 degrees Celsius, and then there are still maybe a few bacteria or whatever that can survive that. But when it gets hotter, it's sort of usually game over. There seems to be a sweet spot at around 37 degrees Celsius. That's our blood temperature. And anyway, when you heat up a material from, let's say, 0 Kelvin to 10 Kelvin, you need only a small amount of thermal energy, and then when you go from 10 Kelvin to 20 Kelvin, you need a bit more, and then from 20 to 30 Kelvin, a bit more. And this becoming more then rolls out in a curve and then sort of hardly increases anymore, and that's the Debye temperature. So from 0 Kelvin, heating the material up until the Debye temperature is a region where quantum fluctuations are helping to heat the system. And that means that quantum fluctuations do indeed play a role. And the Debye temperature, for example, in strontium titanate, depending on which paper you read, is either above 400 Kelvin or even slightly above 500 Kelvin. And many materials have their Debye temperature above room temperature. And that's important because we want to we're looking at the influence of quantum fluctuations at room temperature. That's important to us. And and because reality behaves significantly different at low temperatures, meaning when a system is influenced by quantum fluctuations and the classical fluctuations, thermal fluctuations, have only a very small influence. Therefrom, I conclude that we are living in two universes at the same time. And as I mentioned in other lectures, these virtual particles that appear everywhere in space, also between the planets and between galaxies, they produce the flow of time in space. and there where we see a mass, these virtual particles get structured. So I see mass as structured time, and that has given the possibility to describe every work process and define what energy is based upon the flow of time. I've done that in my other videos. I gave an explanation for that. However, the remaining question is, the basic thought was, why I'm doing that, why I'm working with a time-based approach is, if time stood still, there would be no motion in the universe and nothing could be observed and nothing could happen. And that means that no matter what process exists, it can only exist in time. And therefore, I conclude that everything is a function of time. And if everything is a function of time, everything should be described as a function of time. So we need definitions of energy, mass, electric fields, magnetic fields, described as a function of time. And now the question, what is time? Time is the phenomenon that enforces change. And nothing is standing still, nowhere. And so time is the agent that enforces change, and change is work, and work includes energy. That's why energy, from my view, must be related in first instance to the flow of time and not to mass, or mass times light speed squared. That would be a second level. In my world, when we have a so-called time symmetrical energy conversion process, then reality behaves as if it was mechanical, and in that particular case we can say E is mc square. However, that's not a basic definition, and I prefer the time-based approach. So now the question remaining is, who determines how this change will happen? And that is consciousness. And so in this part we have to elaborate what is consciousness and what is the soul, where is the soul, how is the soul connected to the thermodynamic body. And once we have an understanding of that, we can describe, for example, what a ghost is, how our incarnation works, and that I will cover in part 4. And then on the last slide in part 3, that's point number 4. And the last slide of this consciousness-based universe series, I will make an attempt to define what energy is, not only based upon the flow of time, but also on the phenomenon of consciousness and intention. And it turns out that an intention and a broken symmetry are identical phenomena, and a broken symmetry is the phenomenon that converts something virtual into something observable. T.D. Lee and Young, Nobel Prize in Physics 1957, they elaborated on that. I had that also in my other lectures. So from my view, we are living in two universes. One is visible, that's the universe, the thermodynamic or classical universe that can be described using thermodynamics. And then we have at very cold temperatures, reality behaves different, and that is driven by a different type of virtual particle, creating a different type of time flow. And so in my world, we are living in two universes that are made up, and the quality of the reality in these universes is determined by how the flow of time rolls out, because the flow of time determines the size of space, the quality of energy, and so on. And that's why I am convinced we are living in two universes that are made up from a different type of virtual particle, creating its own quality of time flow. So they are emanating from their own frame, and these two universes, they have an overlap region, obviously at 0 Kelvin, that the influence of this other universe is highest, but there is a region up to the Dubai temperature, which can be above room temperature. And that's the so-called quantum critical window. That's how I call it. And the quantum critical window is the eye, so to speak, through which the influence from that universe can sort of have an impact upon the thermodynamic universe and determine the rules of nature. And you will see as we go through this presentation, it makes sense to lay it out in this way. Okay, so let's get to the next slide, which is here. I assign our physical observable body, that's our cells and DNA and so on, to the classical fluctuations. And then we have a soul, and that's where our actual I identity exists. And our soul is connected to our thermodynamic body via quantum criticality, and there is an argument for it because we know today exactly what the decisive difference is between a living body, physical body that is alive, and a so-called dead molecular arrangement, let's say a stone or whatever, piece of metal. And the difference between a life form and a dead object is quantum criticality. Biomolecules are nearly all exactly tuned to quantum criticality. So quantum criticality clearly makes dead molecules alive. Why? Because everything that is alive has access to a domain that allows for the phenomenon of self-organization and superconductivity and superfluidity. And I conclude from that that our souls exist in the domain of the quantum fluctuations. And yeah, so let us look at a few aspects that have led me to this assumption. Now, I also want to point out at this stage that in this consciousness-based universe presentation, I will push the boundaries. And when you really push the boundaries out to a next level, then you are taking the risk that you might be awfully wrong. And that is absolutely possible. Maybe I'm going to speak here a lot of nonsense. And but that's just how it is. If you want to push the boundaries at a certain stage, you have to take the risk and come up with some statements. And when it turns out that we're wrong, well, then no problem for me anyway. Then we just discard it and develop a new model. And if something is correct, then we just take out that and we further develop that picture. And that's just how science works from my view. So this whole presentation is from a scientific point of view quite a yeah, how shall I say? I will make a lot of risky statements. Let me put it that way, and yeah, and then we just take it from there. However, on the other hand, you will see I have a point, and all that I'm doing is I'm putting the puzzle together using scientific findings from the established scientific communities. So I'm not coming up with totally wild ideas. I'm just putting the puzzle together in a certain way, and that's all. Okay, so let's get to the next slide. Okay, I want to speak about microtubules. Microtubules are a sort of a small nano tube network that is in our cells. And here I will read out what I have here. Microtubules are fibrous hollow rods that function primarily to help support and shape the cell. They also function as roots along which organelles can move throughout the cytoplasm. Microtubules are typically found in all eukaryotic cells and are a component of the cytoskeleton as well as cilia and flagella. Microtubules are composed of the protein tubulin. Microtubules play a huge role in movement within a cell. They form the spindle fibers that manipulate and separate chromosomes during the mitosis phase and the cell cycle. So these microtubules, they are running the show to a large part. They are determining what is being transported to what part in the cell at what part in time. And interesting is these microtubules it's a complex molecule that is tuned exactly to quantum criticality. So also the brain cells, the in our head, they are filled with a huge amount of microtubules. So let's get to the next slide. And here on the left hand side, this yellow pyramid is a neuron cell, and here we have the axons. That's the wiring between the neurons, and interestingly, um, the the microtubules are determining when a neuron is firing an impulse into which direction. So that is not an arbitrary process. So the neuron is a super complex computer on its own. And so the question is, where do the microtubules have the information from? Because if many microtubules do the same thing at the same time, they are telling the neuron to fire a pulse in a certain direction. And then this whole sort of so-called visible or thermodynamic thought process is happening. But the information for the thought process is not coming from the thermodynamic domain at all. It's coming from these microtubules, and these microtubules have little these so-called pi cloud dipoles, and it's like a spin state, and the spin state can switch, and when the spin state switches at the same time on many microtubules, then they can trigger an impulse. So the question is, where does the information come from to trigger these microtubules? And I will get into that just now. Now, just for an explanation of this slide here, this whole picture on the left-hand side, the pyramidal neuron, microtubule, tubulin pathways, and P clouds. I got this picture from a lecture given from Professor Stuart Hameroff, and the paper is called Quantum Criticality in Living Systems, and this information here on the right hand side, I wrote that. So what I see here is that, you know, when a pulse is fired, the pulse is then transferred to the domain of quantum fluctuations via the quantum critical nature of the microtubules, and then our proto-consciousness, as Stuart Hameroff calls it, from my view, that's the soul. And I think, as far as I understood Stuart Hameroff, with proto-consciousness, he means something like a soul. I hope I got it right. Anyway, to me it makes sense. So let's just say there's the soul, and the soul is the actual information processing domain. And after the information has been processed, then the soul sends back information from the domain of quantum fluctuations via the P-cloud dipoles. So that would be an emotion. An emotion is an electromagnetic coherence created by a quantum critical reflection. I will elaborate in the part 3 of the Consciousness Path series about that. And anyway, then information is coming back via the P-cloud dipoles and triggering these microtubules, and then they fire the neurons, and then we have a thought. And okay, let me read out the text here from Stuart Hameroff. Microtubule vibrations are accordion-like compressions and relaxation, with each compression pushing the pi resonance rings slightly closer together, past the quantum critical point, beneath the van der Waals radii, and enabling quantum coherence throughout large regions of the microtubule quantum underground, and overlapping van der Waals radii, causing non-linear repulsion and return to classical state. So we have a permanent oscillation of these microtubules between a thermodynamic classic state and a quantum mechanical state, meaning taking information from the quantum fluctuations. Thus, quantum and classical states alternate in various frequency scales which interact, not unlike music. This solves the problem of having a quantum state isolated from the classical environment and then being able to communicate with that environment, example for inputs and outputs. Microtubules may vibrate and go in and out of quantum critical range. The brain is looking like a scale invariant hierarchy with clocking frequencies at different spatio-temporal scales, clocks within clocks within clocks. Anesthetics act at the deepest level, the fastest clock, the inner apex in the microtubuli quantum underground. And so to wrap this up is we have neurons, and these neurons fire electrical impulses, and that is when we become conscious about a certain situation. And what has always been a mystery is that before we as humans become conscious about something, the firing of the neurons is already happening 2 to 3 tenths of a second beforehand. So something or someone is sort of pre-thinking our thought and implanting it in our brain, and then 3 tenths of a second later, we become conscious of that. And I will get into that point because that's the interesting part. So let's get to the next slide. Now, a bit more to the microtubules. We have these different frequencies, and these microtubules, they also bundle up in sort of in bunches, in microtubule bundles, and they oscillate at the terahertz frequency, and there are slight differences in these terahertz frequencies, and they modulate to much lower frequencies, and that goes right down to the EEG frequency that we can measure electromagnetically. So microtubules is a multi-resonance frequency that goes from terahertz down to hertz. It sort of goes in there are peaks seen for each frequency range, so it's always 3 decimal places lower, so it goes from terahertz to gigahertz to megahertz to kilohertz and hertz and so on. And there is a significant frequency of the microtubules at 613 terahertz. That's a very important frequency, and that is by pure coincidence, one could say. Of course, it's not a coincidence, and it's in the visible light spectrum, and we have sort of the greenish turquoise light spectrum there. I will get into that just now. And as I just said here, number 3, microtubules have slightly different frequencies. These differences in frequencies create much lower frequencies that go right down to the EEG frequency. So that's the frequency pattern and sort of the information transfer mechanism in relation with the microtubules. And once information is coming in from the quantum fluctuations, from the 0-point energy via this 613 terahertz signal, then it is changing something here in the neuron, and then the neuron starts firing, and this firing is a pattern that exists in the thermal classical fluctuations. So the quantum critical nature of the microtubules is connecting the soul, this quantum universe, with the classical universe. So let's get to the next slide. And now, Professor Stuart Hameroff is an anesthetist. Now, I was asking myself, how does a anesthetist get into consciousness research? And the answer is absolutely obvious. What does an anesthetist want to do? He wants to, or she wants to, develop an anesthetic medication, a medicine, or a drug that puts you asleep. It takes your consciousness. And important is that these anesthetic drugs, they shall not do many things. They shall not kill you. They shall not poison you. They shall not stop the heart. They shall ideally not stop the breathing. They shall not harm you in any way. In fact, the anesthetic drug should do absolutely nothing to your body except one single thing. And that is just switch out the light. Take your consciousness so that you're gone. That's all. And interestingly, it is measurable where and how these anesthetic drugs work. And I thought that they are involved in the chemical reaction. They dock at the synaptic gap and change something there, but that's not true. They dock directly at the microtubules and they dampen the frequency of this tubulin, of the microtubules. And there are many resonance frequencies on the microtubules, which can be seen here on the left-hand side. And that is here between 500 and 1100 terahertz. And there is one particular frequency that where the amplitude of that signal is dramatically reduced, and all anesthetic drugs have that exact same property. They work on the 613 terahertz frequency, and when that is damped, you lose your consciousness. So the gateway between our thermodynamic consciousness or getting aware of a situation and the other side, so to speak, seems to be for the reality that we perceive, for our level of perception at 613 terahertz. And 613 terahertz is here in the turquoise area. And as I will show just now, because I'm researching in the area of free energy with quantum paraelectric perovskites, namely strontium titanate, and there we can make strontium titanate from a quantum paraelectric into a ferroelectric by putting light in the red to infrared near infrared light onto it. So that is very close. So could it be that there is a resonance window from this thermodynamic reality towards the quantum fluctuations from, let's say, this greenish bluish area around here, 450 nanometers, maybe 400 nanometers at the most, and then going down in the frequency, meaning the wavelengths are getting longer. Yeah, that's just something I find very interesting. So that seems to be a frequency where our soul connects to our brain, to our thermodynamic body. Now, what is also interesting is that the exact same anesthetics, they work in humans, in animals, in reptiles, in insects, and they act in the exact same way and in the same dose, according to the body weight, of course. And so that is universal, and that I found also very interesting, that all visible animals seem to dock into the same soul domain, so to speak. And and now we have drugs as DMT and psilocybin. They seem to increase this microtubule frequency a little bit, and then we can move into a different domain. It's a domain where we do not belong to, and however, and that reality, for example, in DMT, when you speak with ayahuasca shamans, what they often report, or what first of all, what they do as a preparation meditation is to inhale, a breathing technique where you visualize and focus upon red light into your lung and breathe it out. And the red light is a practical or an access frequency towards the quantum fluctuations. I found that interesting, and the pictures that many ayahuasca people speak about is it has a bluish grayish ground tone to these pictures that they see. So I don't know if it relates to that. I'm just sort of speaking out thoughts in a loud way, we say in German. I don't know if it translates. And I'm just trying to connect things, and and then we can just think about what we can do with it. And so these are some facts, or some learnings that I find very interesting. And what we have above the blue here is the ultraviolet spectrum. So we have here an access from our microtubules towards the quantum fluctuations, and there also seems to be, with quantum paraelectric materials like strontium titanate, an access to quantum fluctuations at the red light area. But when it gets higher, it seems to be cut off. I will elaborate on that just now. Now, if you now let's start on the left-hand side with strontium titanate. Strontium titanate has a Debye temperature of above room temperature, depending on the literature, 400 K, or even above 500 Kelvin. Now, anyway, this here on the left-hand side is a chart that where strontium titanate is looked at low frequencies, where it is in a orthorhombic to rhombohedral phase, but still it is in a paraelectric state, and that is because the quantum fluctuations are acting so strong on the titanium in the middle of the molecule, so that it cannot decide to be ferroelectric, so it cannot create a polarization in the molecule. And now we are pumping that material with mid-infrared light. So that would be here in this infrared area. And when pumping the strontium titanate, it takes a few minutes. It takes a few minutes until there is an imprint created in the domain of quantum fluctuations, and they create a polarization, and they are pulling the titanium more to one side of the perovskite than to the other, making it ferroelectric. So strontium titanate can be tuned or shifted from paraelectric to ferroelectric by pumping it with infrared light. And now, very interesting, when you switch off the pump signal after, let's say, 13 minutes or whatever, just after a few minutes, then the ferroelectric state will remain, and it can remain a few days. So whatever has been done with this with the light, it has programmed the quantum fluctuation. There's a ferroelectric imprint. That's also how Rupert Sheldrake's morphogenetic imprint and information storage in space itself works. It's not stored in the thermal fluctuations. It's stored in the zero-point energy. And the quantum fluctuations is superconducting and super fluid domain, and an imprint is its information is printed into that domain by rotation, and the quality of rotation includes an information, and that information is then stored in the domain of space-time, of seemingly empty space-time itself, but not in relation with the with the thermal fluctuations, but only in relation with quantum fluctuations. So the ferroelectric state will remain for a few days, and then slowly it goes down because it wants to go down. And now this middle chart is very interesting. It shows the same thing like on the left-hand side. We are switching on our pump signal in the infrared light, and then after a few minutes the strontium titanate is shifted to a ferroelectric state, meaning it has a polarization. But now we switch on the ultraviolet light, and the ultraviolet light kills the ferroelectric property straight away. And you can even leave the pump signal switched on. It doesn't matter if it's switched on or it's switched off. But even if it's switched on, the ultraviolet light will destroy the structure within the quantum fluctuation, and that destroys the ferroelectric property. So the strontium titanate is jumping back to a paraelectric state. Now, what do doctors do when they have to clean their the instruments when they make a surgery, for example, or the dentist when it's, I don't know the right word, the tools that he's working with in your mouth have to be disinfected. They put it into an ultraviolet environment to disinfect the cells, and the cells are killed. And why are they killed? Because, from my view, the ultraviolet light separates the soul from the thermodynamic body. That's why ultraviolet light destroys the DNA, because the water molecules, I will get to that later, the water molecules are actually running the show, and They are determining how the mRNA folds in the protein folding process and so on. I spoke about that in part 1 of the Consciousness-Based Universe series. And so ultraviolet light seems to separate the soul from the thermodynamic body, and everything that is sort of below the bluish light moving into the greenish turquoiseish area, from there on down to the red and who knows how far, there seems to be a resonance window between the thermodynamic universe and the soul domain, the domain where the quantum fluctuations exist. And just a side note on our research with where we integrated quantum paraelectric material into a ferroelectric basis, and we are trying to tune it to quantum criticality. We are not triggering it with light, but we are doing it by tuning it with a band gap of sort of 790 nanometers. That's one frequency by which material can be tuned to quantum criticality, a quantum paraelectric perovskite, and that would correspond to a band gap of 1.6 electron volts. So one issue that we're doing in relation with our research is tuning the band gap. However, that's not what I want to get into now, so let's go to the next slide. Okay, now here we have this phenomenon that I briefly touched on early on. Here, does consciousness come too late? Brain electrical activity appearing to correlate with conscious perception of a stimulus can occur after we respond to that stimulus seemingly consciously. So sometimes we seem to consciously react to a stimulus, but we are not conscious of that yet. So how is that possible? So that is why certain doctors, the brain doctors, they think that our thoughts are pre-thought by someone else and we do have no free will by that. Now, I do not agree. From my view, this mechanism works in a different way. Information comes in, for example, via the eye, and when the light and the information hits the eye, it gets transferred already in the eye straight away to the domain of quantum fluctuations where our soul exists. There our soul processes that information, but we are not aware of that. However, that's us, who we really are. We are thinking about what is happening here. And then we are making a decision, an intention. And then the quantum fluctuations, they create a certain coherence. And then that coherence is transferred back to the microtubules in these brain cells, and that goes in a wave 1, in a wave 2, and in a wave 3. And during the wave number 3, we become conscious here as a human in this thermodynamic reality. So consciousness seems to come in too late, but strictly spoken, that is, from my view, not true. It just rolls out in this thermodynamic reality for a few tenths of a second later. That's all. But we are existing as our I identity, not even in this reality. We are not thinking with our brain at all. The brain is just the interface between these two worlds, the thermodynamic universe and the domain of quantum fluctuations. Okay, so let's get to the next slide. Now, interestingly, after, let me just go back. So the impulse comes in to the eye, then our soul processes the information here in the domain of quantum fluctuations, and then a thought or intention is sent back, and that is rolled out in this domain here as an electromagnetic coherence between cells. Can be neurons, can be also other cells in the body, giving a sort of an emotional rush. So and then at a few tenths later we become conscious of that, and now we have the electrical firing, and this electrical firing includes the transfer of chemicals within the synaptic gaps. So that happens later. So now we have here on the left picture the synaptic gap, and when an electric pulse is fired, a so-called molecule is released. It's called this CAMK2. It's a calcium molecule, And this CAMK2 molecule then moves along the neurons and axons, and it docks upon the microtubules. Now these microtubules, they are vibrating in and out of quantum criticality at about 613 terahertz, and it's like a guitar string. And when you dock now this hexagonal stamp of the CAMK2 molecule, this hexagonal stamp here on the right hand side will stay on the microtubule, and it's like pressing the fret on the guitar. You are changing the oscillatory behavior of the microtubule, and then that information is imprinted. So information comes into the eye. We have here at number 3, perception of object, and the information is transferred to quantum fluctuations. Then we have a conscious recognition by the quantum proto-consciousness, which is our soul. Then there is a conscious reaction to that perception. Then the firing of the neurons push the conscious perception into the brain activity and memory storage. So our memories are stored by putting these CAMK2 stamps onto the microtubules at a certain position. It's like pressing the guitar, and it's exactly like music. That's why music is perceived in the way it is perceived in the first place, because we have this guitar, so to speak, in our brain. We are made out of an instrument, so to speak, and the microtubules, and depending on where these hexagonal stamps are placed on, they determine our access code to the quantum fluctuations. So our memories and our consciousness is not in our brain, it's not in the microtubules. All this is just the access code to the soul, so to speak. And I will read out the foil here at number 1 here up here. Microtubules behave like guitar strings that oscillate in and out of quantum critical state. So with frequency of 613 terahertz, permanent information is taken from the soul domain and is transferred back to the electromagnetic domain. So memories seem to be stored within the domain of quantum fluctuations. Okay, so let's get and now the question is, why do we react seemingly conscious to information before we become conscious of that information? Well, that is because our soul was already conscious of that information, because our real I identity is existing in the domain of quantum fluctuations. So our actual existence right now is not even in this universe. It is on the other side, and it has always been there. And so let's walk again through this, what I explained just now. So information moves into our eye or other senses. Then this information moves from the eye directly to the domain of quantum fluctuations, and there it is processed by our soul. And our soul, that's the seat of our real I identity. And that's where, and in the soul domain is where we process the information that is received here in this electromagnetic environment. Then our soul creates an intention for an action, and this information for an intention is coming from the proto-consciousness, and it's transferred to the thermodynamic domain via the quantum critical property of the microtubules and all other biomolecules, because most biomolecules are tuned exactly to quantum criticality. That's why they're alive in the first place. So life without soul does not exist, period. So an intention, which is sort of the construct of thoughts and information and intention, then trigger the firing of neurons, which gives the impression that our conscious action was pre-thought by something or someone else, but that's not true. It was us, our soul, that did the pre-thinking. We are just not aware of it, that we have pre-thought our thoughts about 3/10 or 4/10 of a second before. So there's quite a long delay. I mean, it's a few tenths of a second. And however, the firing then, and then the thought rolls out in the form of firing neurons, and these firing of neurons release these ChemK2 molecules. They dock onto the microtubules to drop a hexagonal stamp that stays on the microtubules, and these stamps influence the vibrational pattern of the microtubules, similar to pressing a fret on a guitar. These stamps represent the access code to the memories that are stored within the domain of quantum fluctuations. Now, Alzheimer disease causes the disassembly of microtubules, and thereby the patient loses contact to his soul and memories. So let's look at that at the next foil. So what happens when a patient becomes Alzheimer? Alzheimer disease is a disease that destroys the microtubules. And when the microtubules are destroyed, well, then the ChemK2 stamps, they are gone as well. So the access code between the thermodynamic reality and the domain of quantum fluctuations, that is destroyed. And when we have no access code to our memories anymore, then we lose contact to our soul. And when you look at an Alzheimer patient, that's also how they act. They act like they are not there anymore. They're not in their body anymore. And however, Alzheimer patients, they still have their memory. They have just lost the access to the memories, the access to their soul. So what I'm saying is the whole brain does not store our memories, and the whole firing of neurons has nothing to do with thinking. It is just making the thoughts that are coming from the domain of the 0-point energy fluctuations, rolling it out into this thermodynamic domain. That's all. So our whole brain is an access code, and our soul and our actual real brain, so to speak, is existing in the domain of quantum fluctuations. So I wrote here, Alzheimer disease is caused by the destruction of microtubules, thereby the access code to our memories, meaning to our proto-consciousness, is lost, and we have lost the connection to our real I identity that exists within the domain of quantum fluctuations. The physical body gets disconnected from ourselves via the destruction of microtubules. So I think that's an interesting aspect. And yeah, and something else, there is, now let's get to this here. There are some cases, and they are not that rare, interestingly, where people get born and the larger part of the brain, up to over 95% of the brain, is simply missing. But these people are living a normal life. They are doing a high school, they study at university, and they can show normal behavior, everything normal, but 95% of the brain is missing. So the question is, what for do we need a brain? So what is happening? So here on the left-hand side, we see one of these patients, and on the right-hand side, we see a picture of a normal brain. And what is happening here from my view is that since this water here is enclosed 360 degree by our skull and head and DNA that we are made of, that means that our soul occupies that whole space, and our soul is structuring the water molecules into the way our soul wants it. So the water is overtaking the role of the brain, and the water can do that because the water can create electrical wires, and it can be mechanically stiff, as I showed in part 1 of this presentation in relation with water. And the water is involved, is controlling and driving the protein folding process, which is ultra complex. So the information is coming from the quantum fluctuations in here. And yeah, there is an interesting phenomenon with Alzheimer patients. Sometimes when just a day before such a patient dies, what can happen is that these Alzheimer patients, they suddenly gain back their memory. It's just there, and it's there because I think the human knows when he dies. So when death gets closer, the soul intensifies its intention, and the intention structures, uh, yeah, the water between these brain cells with the destroyed microtubules, and that brings back the memories that is still there in the domain of quantum fluctuations, where the soul is, and that's how Alzheimer patients can regain their memories just before they die. And yeah, that's an assumption of mine. So let's go on with assumptions and let's get to the next foil. Yeah, this is the last foil now of part 2. And so, conclusion regarding microtubules. Microtubules, water, and all other quantum critical biomolecules represent an interface towards the domain of quantum fluctuations. Within the domain of quantum fluctuations, our real I identity exists. That's where our soul exists. And our physical body seems to be only an interface to our proto-consciousness. So, microtubules are directly related to conscious experience. So, when microtubules and all other biomolecules, quantum critical biomolecules, are directly related to conscious experience in this thermodynamic classic reality, then we have to now, or can now, answer the question: what is consciousness? What is the soul? Where is the soul? How is the soul connected to our thermodynamic body? Well, that's quantum criticality. That's already one question answered. And what is an emotion? And how do these phenomena relate? And when we have that, then we can elaborate on how the process of incarnation possibly works. I mean, there is still a lot unknown, of course, but I think we can now make another little step into that direction, and we can develop a very schematic picture about what a ghost could be, a dead soul, so to speak, and what happens when we die, what happens when we get born. And I will speak about that in part 3 of A Consciousness-Based Universe. Thanks for listening.